just talking about the evolution of your career. So you come out of Dartmouth, and it takes a while until you hit that 1991 mark, and you take that naturalization oath. So where were you career-wise? I'm curious, like where you started, and then how you ended up with this vertical that you're building, specifically as it relates to being a creator, a media maker.
I graduated in 1983. I did a program in political philosophy that summer. And then I took a job with an alumni group at Princeton University, editing a magazine called Prospect Magazine. Interestingly, Samuel Alito, now on the Supreme Court, was one of the subscribers to that magazine and involved with that organization to a degree. In 1985, I came to Washington, D.C. to work as the managing editor of a conservative political quarterly, a scholarly magazine called Policy Review. I did that for 2 years. Some articles I wrote. I was very prolific in those days. I was writing in the Washington Post, New York Times, lots of other places. And it came to the attention of the Reagan White House. And I was invited to come in and talk to them in the White House mess. And right there on the spot, they offered me a job. And I said, guys, I can't really work here. I'm not a U.S. citizen. And I remember the men all looked at each other, and one of them kind of jokingly said, well, are you a Reaganite? And I was like, well, yeah. And they were like, all right, we'll figure it out. Sure enough, they did. And so amazingly, even though I was a policy analyst in the Reagan White House, at that time, I was on the pathway to citizenship, but I wasn't yet a U.S. citizen.
That's so interesting. So did you have the chance to meet President Reagan? Did you spend some time with him?
Only in the most cursory way. I mean, I was in my mid-20s. And so I got to stand in the back of the room and watch Reagan on the big table with the senior staff. But I was basically observing and taking notes. So I wasn't participating in the meeting. But it was, for me, a wonderful window into government at the highest level. And since I haven't been back in government since those days, it was an important little segment of my life. Now, my career really began after I left the Reagan White House. I was offered a fellowship, a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and I began my first book, which was Illiberal Education. It's actually the book that didn't coin but made famous the term political correctness. And the book was a huge bestseller in 1991. It came right on the heels of another important book by Alan Bloom called The Closing of the American Mind. And Alan Bloom's book and my book sort of defined the public critique of political correctness in that era.
So it's interesting, when you talk about Reagan, a lot goes through my head, but for most people think about his economy. I mean, I lived through it, and it was just booming. It was a real celebration here in the United States on the ground. We saw all different marketplaces and sectors within the economy really growing. The spirit of entrepreneurship was flourishing. But for me, the godfather of capitalism is Alexander Hamilton. We need to go all the way back, right, to the beginning. I think he really triggered, his philosophy really triggered in many ways the spirit of American ingenuity and entrepreneurship. And I think, honestly, like if he didn't have that position early on during the founding of our nation, we might not be as capitalistic as we are today. It looks like, from an outsider's perspective, you, Dinesh, embody that spirit. I look at like your breadth of work, like you used the word earlier, prolific, to describe what you were writing back in the day for Washington Post, New York Times. But if you look at your broader body of work today, it's prolific. I mean, an entrepreneur at the heart. How many films and books have you created so far to date?
I've lost a little bit of count on the books. I'm at about 15 on the books, and I've done almost all my books are in one way or another a meditation or interpretation of the meaning of America. Between 2008 and 2012, I wrote 3 books on Christian apologetics, which represents a sort of diversion for me. But apart from that, most of my books are focused in one way or another as interpretations of the founding, the importance of the Civil War, the more recent history of America, but also threats to America from the inside and from the outside. So that's been my unifying topic, if you will. I was, even though you described me as an entrepreneur, I never saw myself that way. My parents were, salaried career guys. My dad, as I say, was an engineer all his life. In fact, he worked for the same company pretty much his entire life. And I was for about 12 years in so-called think tanks, which are nonprofit research foundations. First, the American Enterprise Institute, but then the Hoover Institution, which is part of Stanford University. This is when I lived in California in the early 2000s. I did my first film, which was called Obama's America, in 2012. And so I've been a little over a decade in the filmmaking business, documentary filmmaking, and I've now made 8 documentary films. I'm happy to say that's been a very successful pursuit. Of the top 10 political documentaries, I believe I have 3 in that list, about the same as Michael Moore.
Congratulations. That's really, truly remarkable. I know how difficult it is to create a film. There are so many moving parts, starting not just with the creative idea, but the financing. So how do you put together the financing, if you don't mind me asking? How do you structure the financing for these films?
It's much easier for me now than it was in the beginning, but I'll tell you, at the beginning, what happened was I had written a book on Obama called The Roots of Obama's Rage. I published an excerpt of it as the cover story in Forbes magazine. And it came to the attention of a fellow, Joe Ricketts, who is the founder of Ameritrade, TD Ameritrade, now Ameritrade Bank. And Joe said to me, he goes, "Hey, Dinesh, he goes, I'm going to buy an ad in the Wall Street Journal to urge people to read your book." And I said, "Joe, don't do that. That's like $100,000 to do that. And I'll sell 200 books. It's not going to be worth it." But he ignored me and he did that. And afterwards he said, how'd I do? And I go, "Well, you helped me sell 200 books. And he laughed and he said, "Well, how do we take your message? It's so important and help it to reach 1 million people." I go, "Well, 1 million people don't buy hardcover political books." I said, "But the only way to do that I know of is to make a documentary film." Because I'd remembered that Michael Moore had made Fahrenheit 9/11 and dropped that film right in the middle of the 2004 campaign. So Joe goes, "All right, well, what would it cost to do a film?" So I said, "Let me talk to a few friends of mine and come up with an idea." So I came to Joe Ricketts and said, "It'll cost $2.5 million for me to make a film." So what he does is he whips out his checkbook. He says, "Here's $100,000. Go and find 24 other people to give you the same, and then you can make a film." So it seemed incredible at the time, but that is what I did. I was able to convince 24 other people. And I don't think any of those people thought they were going to get their money back. I think they all thought, well, we want to support Dinesh, encourage him. He's a well-meaning and smart fellow. And but my first film was immensely successful. All these people got their money back, and then a lot. And that created a kind of a financing base for my films. Now, I'll say, in all honesty, my pitch to investors is this. I say, "Guys, I'm pitching you on what I call recycled philanthropy. I'm not promising to make you any money, but I'll work really hard to get you your money back so you can give it back to me to do my next film. So this way, I'm not going to be asking you for a new dollar time after time. It's the same dollar, but I'm going to run it around the block multiple times, and you'll get a lot of bang for your buck, so to speak."
And has that worked?
That has worked.
Have you had the same investors come back through?
Pretty much. Now, in the early films, I had a pretty large pool of investors. I'd rely on, 25 investors or 30 investors. Fortunately, for later films, I'm now down to, I'll typically try to get 3 or 4 investors. Much easier for me to manage, because it's a full-time job to manage 30 investors. You have to remember, these are people who put up money, but they also all have their own ideas about how the film should be made and who I should interview. And so I'm constantly fielding calls with ideas, and you got to send them all the rough cut. So it's easier, just as a practical matter, to work with a smaller pool of investors than a larger pool.